people have asked me, in the last 24 hours, what can the courts do to fix this problem of diversity in the NFL? And, simply put, that's not the court's job. The court's job is just to tell you if what you're doing is improper, if what you've done is improper. It's not their job to tell a private business how best to conduct their activities. That's going to be the NFL to look in the mirror and say, hey, if we really think diversity is a priority, which it should be, are we doing enough?
Has to say about this.
Dan Lust, welcome to the program. Obviously a big day, and I want to thank you first off for a few minutes because I know you're very busy. Brian Flores, obviously, going nuclear on the NFL with this racial discrimination lawsuit. So, Dan, I'm going to go about it as a layman, asking you to try to describe this to the fans as best as possible. When you saw this lawsuit, and I spent, far too much time reading all 58 pages, what struck me is, how many allegations there were. And, things like tampering and things like tanking. I don't know what that has to do with racial discrimination, but I mean, the NFL's history is long and demonstrable when it comes to hiring minorities. So what was your sort of first take when you saw the suit?
John, my initial instinct was similar to yours. There's a lot of, for lack of a better term, kind of some lightning rod issues in there. Not all of them deal particularly with race, right? The fact that Brian Flores was allegedly offered $100,000 to throw games to get her better draft position. I'm not sure what the racial tie-in is here. And just so people are saying this, the reason we're saying that this is a complaint about race is because those are the causes of action. There's one under federal law, there's one under state law, and one under city law. And there's there's nothing with respect to, as far as I can tell, collusion or any other type of cause of action that would make that type of that claim legitimate, right? Why $100,000, I'm going to call it a bribe, right, or an offer to bribe someone is relevant to the case. So that certainly stood out on a number level. John, you're gonna have to pardon me. I'm gonna turn this alarm off because I have to remember to come to the appearance, John.
I hear it. Jody Mack has to remember to come to the appearance. I think you want to overslept.
No, I apologize. So but the long and short, that's what certainly stood out to me on a number of levels. I think this complaint did a good job at catching the public's attention. But not necessarily so, good of a job at keeping the public's attention on what is particularly at issue in this case.
So when you looked at that, I don't think these two things are mutually exclusive, Dan, and the fact that you could potentially have a disgruntled employee when it came to Brian Flores and Stephen Ross, and you also have the long history, as I mentioned, with the NFL. The Rooney Rule. And I think we all know in Minnesota today, the thought process around the league is that Jim Harbaugh is going to get that job. And they spent 9 hours with Patrick Graham, an African-American candidate. Yesterday, D'Amico Ryans, a former Eagles linebacker, pulled out of the coaching search. And let's be honest, because he knew he wasn't going to get the job. So there is an element of checking boxes, as actually Brian explained on CBS this morning, if you saw his appearance there. Is that an NFL problem? Like, I don't know how to fix that. In the fact that if somebody wants to hire somebody, and remember, Minnesota's GM was just hired, and it's Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, who was an African-American man, and he wants Jim Harbaugh because they worked together in San Francisco. So all of these things are very contextually. But as far as the Rooney Rule, employment law, is that just a bad piece of legislation, Dan?
I mean, here's the thing, and this is why the complaint is so difficult to kind of wrap our heads around, right? The Rooney Rule was created for, I think, a good reason, right? To help create diversity in front offices. And what Brian Flores is essentially saying is that the NFL has not done a good enough job with that purpose. We look no further, right? And you point out the statistics. We currently have one NFL head coach that's African-American, that's Tomlin over in Pittsburgh. 6 general managers, at least as of today, are African-American. So, if the NFL's stated goal is to promote diversity, the numbers speak for themselves, right? The question is, John, to your point, is that because of some type of illicit racial activity on behalf of the NFL, or just are they just kind of happening, right? Like if you ask, I think anybody, right, who's a better hire for the job, Brian Dable or Brian Flores? They're both great hires, right? I think the fact that the Giants picked Brian Dable over Brian Flores doesn't necessarily say anything racial about the Giants, right? Certainly there's a lot of other portions of the complaint, a lot of other coaches that are brought up, Jim Caldwell being one of them. But just talking about Brian Flores, I don't know if the Giants' decision in and of itself necessarily speaks to anything that was illicit, but what Flores is essentially saying, and why this is brought as a class action lawsuit, which is not just a case of Brian Flores versus the Dolphins, Broncos, Giants, and the NFL. It's Brian Flores and the coaches that came before him and the general managers that came before him and those that came before him that didn't get those jobs. So if you ask me, I don't know if Brian Flores in particular has the strongest case here. The fact that John Elway shows up an hour late to a meeting, and I read this and I'm sure you just caught your eye in the complaint, that it looked like, Elway was hungover at this meeting in 2019.
Yeah, I
with
don't
Brian
know how
Flores.
you prove that. Yeah.
Does that mean that the interview was a sham? I mean, it might just mean that, assuming it's true, that Elway was unprofessional, right, or that came kind of disheveled. But you're connecting a lot of lines. So, for a class action case, sometimes, John, what they say is that there's strength in numbers. Maybe not every one particular case is going to be that strong, but the mountain and the wave of evidence, I think that's probably what the NFL is concerned about, especially. There's some active head coaches or active coaches that are named in this complaint. So, and who knows, John? Maybe we're having a conversation a month from now where Brian Flores is a head coach. He's still interviewing for the Texans job and the Saints job. That's what makes this very peculiar.
It is, and I do think class action would make this more powerful if more people would get involved, because you sort of limit that sort of the context of an individual situation. Which I think there are some issues with this particular lawsuit. But I do want to ask you, and this is probably too far in the weeds, but I need to get it out of the way because I just need an answer on this. When you as a lawyer see a lawsuit, and a lot of people pointed this out to me, and I give them credit, so it wasn't me, but in the particular lawsuit, they cited Plessy versus Ferguson, banning segregation in places of a public accommodation, and it did the exact opposite. It held up at the time. It was, I think, in the late 1800s. But when there's a mistake like that, and you take that suit to court, does that affect things? Is that material, or is that just somebody made a mistake?
I mean, it certainly depends on the context. I think what you're asking, there's a context in the law of, right, if something is good law on the books, unless it's overturned in court, I mean, it's going to, better for worse, be considered good law. We have the conversation, which I'm sure you guys covered, the the baseball antitrust lawsuit that's going on now, and also New York federal court. Sometimes you have bad laws on the books. Doesn't mean that they're right. Doesn't mean that they'll hold up. So, I mean, maybe that's the easiest way to explain it. Baseball, the Supreme Court's been clear, at least in the last couple of years, that they should not have an antitrust exemption, yet they still do. Just waiting for a court case to overturn it. So, yeah, I'm not sure of the context of the Plessy versus Ferguson application here. But I guess
I was just the mistake part of it, and the fact that they got it wrong. Would that impact the thought of some of the other accusations and questions, whether there were mistakes in the actual lawsuit?
Yeah, I think this is where my mind goes. And John, you mentioned it earlier, right? Plessy versus Ferguson dealt, with the case has nothing to do with sports associations and private leagues. That's maybe where someone could say the cases aren't similar. But the NFL came up with this Rooney Rule on their own. It was an initiative that they came up with. It wasn't legislation that the Congress and the states put on them. The NFL made that rule. So people have asked me, in the last 24 hours, what can the courts do to fix this problem of diversity in the NFL? And simply put, that's not the court's job. The court's job is just to tell you if what you're doing is improper, if what you've done is improper. It's not their job to tell a private business how best to conduct their activities. That's going to be the NFL to look in the mirror and say, hey, if we really think diversity is a priority, which it should be, are we doing enough? Is it true that the Rooney Rule isn't doing enough? And that's when I read the NFL statement yesterday, John, on just a kind of holistic level, said that the claims were without merit.
Yeah.
Now, the legal claims might be without merit. That's certainly possible. at the end of the day, Flores has the burden of proof. He's the plaintiff. But I don't think Flores is wrong that there's a problem with diversity in the NFL. You could just look at the scorecard, right?
Yeah.
Look at that 1 out of 32. Look at that 6 out of 32. They're not totally without merit. So I think the NFL's got to look at itself a little bit in the mirror, just like they did with Kaepernick, and see what are we doing wrong here, and can we improve on our practice? Because that's the NFL's job. That's not the court's job.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because one of the interesting parts where they brought up Jim Caldwell, who had a good run in Indianapolis and was fired after one bad year. Same thing in Detroit, and obviously you look in hindsight, and the coaches in Detroit since Jim Caldwell haven't been able to do as well. But then I say, I live in Philadelphia. I cover the Eagles. They fired a Super Bowl winning coach 3 years after he made the playoffs. 3 consecutive years, had one bad season. They fired him. I mean, I don't know sort of how you fix that in the core aspect of Brian Flores not getting along with Stephen Ross. I don't know how any court, anywhere, any system can fix that.
Well, here's where it gets tricky, right? Like the example that kept coming to my mind is the moment I heard that Jim Caldwell was right. Okay, Caldwell probably shouldn't have gotten fired. You know who else shouldn't have gotten fired? Probably Marty Schottenheimer the year he went 12-4, right?
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily an issue of race. It's just the owner makes a decision at the end of the day. And it's the plaintiff's burden anytime they bring a case to show, right, in a case about racial discrimination, that firing, or let's say for Marty Schottenheimer, let's say it's a case about age discrimination, right? There's all sorts of discrimination, that firing was made for some illicit purpose. And that's the tricky part here. On a case-by-case basis, I'm not sure you can make that, right? Did the Detroit Lions, we could look after the fact. I think we can all say that was probably not the right move to get rid of him. The Lions have certainly had a lot of trouble winning, in recent years. This most recent year, notwithstanding, or obviously including this recent year. But the question is, again, strength in numbers, right? Do you have enough here? Is there something colorable? And this is where the lawyers have to really make their money here. Do they have enough to get the case into discovery? And this is where, John, I find that the case gets really interesting. I'm going to take you down a little bit of a rabbit hole, and then I think you'll see where I'm going with this. There's about, I want to say, there's a lot of cases that we're talking about on our show, but 3 cases in particular. Flores, right? Washington football team, that investigation, right? And then the John Gruden case. All of these cases have something in common. They're all about getting to the emails, getting to the heart of the case.
Yeah, discovery. We just mentioned that. Yeah.
Right. We talked about Gruden, right? How is it possible that only one guy has these bad emails out of tens of thousands of people, and it's just with the Washington football team, right? Maybe that's just sign of the tip of the iceberg. Maybe these conversations and these bad emails, if Gruden can rise to the ranks and be this head coach, the highest paid head coach in the league, it would be maybe odd if nobody else in the entire league had any sentiment similar to Gruden. And that's what the Flores case is seeking to do. That's actually what the Gruden case is seeking to do, to get those emails. And that's what the Washington football team, congressional hearings are trying to do, to get the emails. And if you get those emails, all of a sudden you could start connecting those dots. Maybe there's more that we don't know. But what the court's going to ask at this early stage of the case, is this colorable? Is there something potentially here? Because we're not certainly going to kick a case out because the plaintiff doesn't really know what's going on. We're going to let you to get behind the scenes, ask some tough questions in what we call discovery, and flesh it out. But this is phase 1. All Flores really has to do is show enough to get to the next level. And then, right, depositions, discovery, emails, texts. Maybe there's a lot here, but we just don't know at this phase.
Well, and that was my next question. That next step, can you kind of take people through what has to be proven, what sort of bar has to be reached? Because, and I was trying to find, as I said, Brian was on CBS this morning, and he said the owners are checking the box with the Rooney Rule. So he used that term, but then he admitted there's no way to know for sure. So if you're on national TV and you're admitting that, is that obviously it's not, you're not under oath. There's no, there's nothing that is demonstrably proven by that. But I'll ask you, when you're trying to get this lawsuit to the next phase, can something like that hinder you?
1,000,000%. That's why I saw the comments. I was a little, if I'm his lawyer, I probably wouldn't have told him to say that. Not that you'd ever tell your client to lie, but sometimes it's better. Some things are better left unsaid, as they say. So where that would probably come up, let's say I'm the NFL, right? And we go all the way down the line. No bad emails come out. Nothing comes out. And we go to depositions, and I say, Brian, no emails have come out, right? You would acknowledge that nothing. There's no receipts of anything that was made as a racial purpose and whatnot. Okay. And you said at the time, right, when you went on CBS, on February 2nd, that you had no way of knowing, right? And you were kind of insinuating that you were waiting for emails to come. So we're sitting here today, right? It's 2023, 2024, whenever they do depositions. What has changed? So Brian Flores has essentially told the NFL, right? He has no idea other than his thoughts and hopes that he's going to find something in discovery. So you don't want to necessarily reveal it. Is it going to hurt him? Not necessarily, but you can certainly use that against him. And I think where this case goes from here, John, the next step, right? Filing the complaint is one thing. The next thing after that is usually a response to the complaint. You could answer it and just say you deny the allegations, or you can make a little bit more of aggressive maneuver, what's called a motion to dismiss for facial insufficiency, or a motion to move the case to arbitration. I think the NFL is going to do both of those because we just saw it happen in the John Gruden case about 2 weeks ago. I think the NFL is going to try to kick this out. Just like we saw in their statement, they're going to say it's meritless, and they're going to try to argue that under Brian Flores' contract, that any disputes stemming from his hiring, his firing, all have to be sent to arbitration. I'm not sure if this undertones of racial firings and hirings, a collective class action, if that's really so contractual, but I think the NFL is certainly going to make that argument.
We're talking to Dan Lust. You see right there. Follow him on Twitter at Sports Law Lust. His podcast, Conduct Detrimental, which I love. I love that title, Dan. And I do want to bring up that discovery part of the issue, because I think everybody looks at the NFL and everybody knows they don't want to get to that discovery process. And you mentioned the Gruden emails. It's hard for people to believe there's only, of all those emails, that those were the only ones that were untoward, so to speak. So as a lawyer, from a strategy standpoint, I want you to put on your hat and say, what are they trying to accomplish here? Is this finances? Is this class action? Is this getting to discovery to force the NFL's hand? What do you think the long-term strategy is?
It's a great question. I think if you ask me, just moving over here for a second, right? The John Gruden case is not about money, right? Because John Gruden's not, he's not going to coach again. He wants to kind of right the wrongs. I could tell you pretty confidently that case is not about money. Now, let's go one step. Let's go over here for a second. You'll see where I'm going with this. The Colin Kaepernick case. I don't really think that was about money. I think that was teaching the NFL a lesson. I do. I don't think that was necessarily about money at the end of the day. But then again, you could maybe make the argument Kaepernick hadn't played in the NFL in a number of years, so maybe he needed some money, right? You can certainly see that both ways. Brian Flores is an interesting case because last I checked, he's still interviewing again for these Texans and the Saints jobs. So I guess you didn't necessarily ask.
And he could certainly be a coordinator even if he didn't get a head coaching job.
I think we'd all collectively be shocked if without this lawsuit, right? And the lawsuit may be a game changer, but if he didn't get an offensive or defensive coordinator position in the NFL, knowing the success that he's had with the Patriots and the Dolphins. But he asked me what this case is about. Flores is still interviewing for jobs, so I don't necessarily think it's about the money, because he's still seemingly going to get one of these jobs. But I think it's about sending a message. And if you're sending a message, you become that much more of a scary proposition for the NFL. John Gruden's not going to go away. You can offer to pay John Gruden like $2 million, $5 million, whatever it is. He wants the people that release those emails. He wants them to feel it at depositions and trial and whatnot. I think that's what we're leaning to with Flores. I'm reading all of his statements, everything. He says that I'm paraphrasing, but the racial injustice that's going on in the NFL needs to be brought to the light. And there's a lot here that needs to be exposed, uncovered. He's using words like that. That tells me this is a guy who wants to go into the NFL's books, their email servers, and see what's going on behind the scenes, because he's, maybe distraught that he didn't get the Giants job, distraught that he didn't get other jobs, distraught that he was, terminated from the Dolphins job. He wants to know what this, undertext is in the NFL. I think that's what the basis of this lawsuit is. I think that's what the core of what Flores is seeking, and whatever other, NFL personnel decide to join him in this lawsuit.
Well, there's been a lot of employment law issues across many industries, not just the NFL. But when you do have these sort of laws, and I'll circle back to the Rooney Rule one more time, and I think you're right. I think the thought process behind that was to do good and to try. I will give the NFL. I don't give the NFL much credit for much at times, but I do think they were trying to improve things with the Rooney Rule. I think the motives were altruistic, so to speak. But how does that go from altruism to accomplishment? In other words, how do you make people not just check the box when you force them to check the box?
I mean, that's the question, right? And also, you have to prove that people are just checking the box. I think that's the point that people gloss over here. Just because, and maybe people will understand this, right? It's not necessarily a legal concept. Why do we think that the Giants checked the box here? Why do we think? I mean, and I guess I haven't heard of a case in the past with someone attempting to challenge this. But the complaint itself pretty much says that without Bill Belichick's text message, they wouldn't know that the box was just checked. They would have no idea of knowing that. And then and we're saying the box is checked, right? That Giants had already made up their mind to hire Daboll, and they just had to go through the process of bringing Flores in just to check the box. Now, I saw the Giants statement. Giants statement said that Flores was in consideration until the 11th hour, which I'm just going to tell you, right? I'm not in the Giants room. I think, John, as you know, full disclosure, I used to work for the Giants in their PR department. I've had no involvement with the team in the last 10 years. But I could just tell you, right, on paper, it makes a lot of sense that Flores and Daboll are both in consideration till the 11th hour because they're both really highly qualified, successful coaches. So my concern that people aren't paying attention to, Bill Belichick, right, obviously has ties to the Giants organization, but he is not, last I checked, right, he's not an employee of the New York Giants organization. He's not an agent of the New York Giants organization. He doesn't work for them, and he certainly doesn't speak for them. So who is Bill Belichick to say, the Giants have already hired Brian Daboll? Congrats, Brian Daboll. I mean, Brian Flores. I mean, who am I texting? I have no idea. I probably shouldn't be sending text messages, right? That's the whole smoking gun of the case. And if I'm the Giants, would I go back and say, I'm like, good for Bill Belichick. I don't know who he's talking to, but his sourcing was wrong. We had not made a decision. If anything, maybe we were leaning towards Daboll because he just had an incredible performance against Bill Belichick's Patriots, right? Against the Kansas City Chiefs. But we certainly hadn't made up our mind. That's going a step too far. And that step too far, honestly, John, is the crux of this entire case. It's certainly possible that Flores was in consideration for the job until the 11th hour. And until we see texts or emails or some physical receipts, that prove otherwise, this is an issue of credibility, which, the NFL is going to have to like their chances on it, because it's again, the plaintiff's burden at the end of the day, Brian Flores, to show that the NFL acted with a discriminatory purpose, which, I don't think the Bill Belichick shows you. I think it's a text from Bill Belichick to Brian Flores. I don't think it proves the case by any means.
No, and I agree, and that was my sentiment from the start. And I've seen, you mentioned the burden, and Brian Flores has the burden to prove racial discrimination in this particular suit. So that was my question with, let's say Stephen Ross is the dumbest owner in the history of the world, and he's got a canceled check for $100,000 paying Brian Flores for a loss.
Right.
Which I don't think he does, but let's stipulate he did, and he made that mistake. It still doesn't prove his case. Am I wrong in that?
No, and I'm gonna go one step further. Obviously I'm a full-time lawyer. There's two different ways to draft a complaint. You draft a complaint the way that these guys did in the Flores case, which I can see the positives and negatives, with a lot of electricity, a lot of lightning rods. Here's the $100,000, the text from Bill Belichick. Those guys are putting their cards on the table to draw up media interest, which they did. Congrats. I have 15 interviews today. I'm telling you, they did a successful job at doing that, right? But on the other end, when sometimes the way I like to draft complaints, it just depends. I don't want to put everything out there because I like to hit people over the head, right? As the case moves on, right? I want to lull them into a sense of security. I'm going to tell you just from my reading of this, if there was a smoking gun, right? A $100,000 check or some type of bank statement that showed a $100,000 payment to Flores, I imagine it would have come out, just seeing how the attorneys drafted this complaint, right? They put the Bill Belichick text out there. Why wouldn't they have put their other smoking guns out, just, getting into their head? But as for that $100,000, let's not make light of this one as well. I've never heard of an allegation like that with respect to an owner. I've heard of an allegation like that with respect to a manager, and that was Pete Rose, right? Who was alleged to have had some financial incentive to win or lose games. So it's a loaded allegation. It doesn't prove discrimination one way or the other. I think what I can gather from the complaint is that Flores' discrimination claim against the Dolphins is that he was fired when he had a relatively good year, that he exceeded expectations, maybe 2 years in a row.
Yeah.
Why am I getting fired? Same like Jim Caldwell and so on and so forth. I don't see a direct line between the $100,000 bribe 2 years ago and why you were fired in 2022. I can't see what that link is. And again, if there was proof, I think we would have seen it at this point, honestly. And not that it's not there. I just think it would have been out in this complaint.
Yeah, understandable. And I want to thank you, Dan. Last one for me, and I'll let you get to your 14 other interviews today.
It's a record, by the way. And listen, I say it in all sincerity. It's a very important topic that we are putting a spotlight on.
Yeah.
It's sometimes an uncomfortable conversation for John, you and I, to be having as two white males. But that's the point of these lawsuits, right? Colin Kaepernick instituted a lot of good change to the NFL, and it required uncomfortable conversations of people of black, white, brown, of all sorts, to have these type of conversations. So yeah, I think it's great. He's going on. Flores is going to go on ESPN in about 45 minutes. It's on CBS. It's certainly an important issue, and that's why I have a lot of trouble with the NFL statement again, that this is without merit, right? There wouldn't be so much interest in media interest on this particular lawsuit if the whole claim was without merit. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
So I think the NFL
and everybody knows that's my problem. Everybody knows the claim does have merit, but I don't think this is necessarily the case to prove it. And that was where I think the class action part. I think if you can get a group of coaches together, but then you have to start talking about guys. A group of people putting their careers on the line. Maybe it could be retired coaches, things of that nature. It really is a difficult subject. And I'm glad I was able to get you for a few minutes this morning, Dan, because nobody explains these things better than you. New York Law School, obviously a professor there, the host of Conduct Detrimental, the podcast at Sports Law Lust. Dan Lust, best in the business. Thank you very much. I will tell Jody to send you an apology for not making it for the program. Obviously, you have a history with Jody McDonald or your dad, but it's thrilling to have you. It always is. And I appreciate you jumping by and get to those 14 other interviews. You got a busy day, buddy.
And I got two kids buzzing in the background. See if I survive it. Thanks, John.